maybe just a couple of biographical details before I hand over to our speakers. Isabelle was born in France and she lives between Paris and Zurich. She has exhibited extensively across France and also internationally, and just to name a couple of her most recent solo shows, there's a M Museum in Leuven, the Kunsthalle Bern show, and a show at Le Magasin in Grenoble. Upcoming, she has a group show at the Musée de l'Art Moderne in Paris and also at the Louvre. Briony Fer is an art critic and art historian, and she has also written extensively about modern and contemporary art, most notably recently about Gabriel Orozco, Roni Horn, David Batchelor, and Tacita Dean, and she published her book The Infinite Line in 2004. She has also organized exhibitions of Eva Hesse's studio work and worked on an exhibition with Gabriel Orozco. She is the professor of history of art at the University College here in London. And now please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm really delighted to be able to be in conversation with Isabelle, whose work I've admired and been interested in for a long time. And so we were talking together, which was a great pleasure for me to be able to think with Isabelle more, just to have that conversation, and I hope we can in some way replicate that, because I certainly learned a lot from it, and there's much more I think to think about. But we thought we might begin by, I might begin by asking Isabelle just to, in a way, describe this work that we have in the main gallery, Paysage, avec, poussin et Témoins, oculaires. And that you might actually just start by describing what is there, and I think that might open up some of the key issues in your work.
Mm-hmm. So to describe in a simple way the installation that is presented is in the main room. You may see that it's built around a frontal point of view, and it's in an installation of pedestals and standing walls on which painted black, on which different kinds of objects are displayed. And the whole installation forms a sort of landscape that is a translation from a landscape from Nicolas Poussin, who is this classical painter from the 17th century. And so it's a sort of composition that is an extension of one of his paintings. And I constructed it in a way that is quite simple, with a perspective that is translated in two ways, basically, with bigger object in front and smaller object at the back. And it's a sort of point of view from below, in the way that the foreground show low pedestals and the background shows higher pedestals. So you have a perspective view with more important pedestals at the foreground and smaller at the background.
Even in that title, you have something that I suppose many of us would come thinking they were polar opposites. You have Poussin on the one hand, and you have the Témoins oculaires, the oculist witnesses in English, which is obviously a Duchamp references. There are the oculist witnesses in the large glass, and to put in your title Duchamp and Poussin, perhaps you could explain a little bit about how those two sources could come together, or what possibly could Duchamp have to do with such a sort of classicist pictorial model as the Poussin model.
What I was very interested in the Poussin model was the fact that it's a sort of, he painted landscapes that are archetypical classical landscape, and the way he did them in his working process and also the result as something that is very abstract in its construction and somehow metaphysical. And I think that this abstraction and the way that the landscape think of the viewer may be related to ways Duchamp thought about the viewers looking at, for example, works like Étant donné. And so it's basically all about the position of the viewer in front of composition that is both pictorial and figurative and abstract.
Okay, so on the one hand you have this highly abstract or abstracted model which is Poussinesque with these black planes, very architectonic, very structural. And then you have the oculist witness idea, which is the, in a way, it's not us, a literal viewer, it's an imaginary viewer as well who can move around. But what about the, that in some ways is a very vivid, polarity, which isn't a set of opposites in your work. You can't kind of hold them apart. So that itself is really interesting. But just to describe the stuff of it, what about that piece of wood in the front? And what about that, is it onyx, those ornaments? And what about the jewelry? That seems to suggest certainly a theatrical environment, or can you speak a little bit about those props and ornaments?
Yeah, for this specific landscape, because it's part of a series and it's the sixth piece of the series, for this specific landscape, it was about the notion of nature and mimic of the nature. So you have an organic body at the first, at the foreground, which is then at the second ground there is a copy of a natural thing, which is a flower, a pot with flower, and then there are different elements of coming, let's say, from a flea market or antiquaria shop, and all these elements are linked to the representation of nature and its copy, and also to ornament, indeed. And I lost what I wanted to say.
Are they meant to, in some ways they seem quite archaic. They seem like ornaments. They seem, yes, I can imagine you found them in flea markets, and that will recur in a lot of your work, some of which we're seeing on the screen at the moment. There's something that looks like a piece of jewelry, which also will recur in a lot of your work. So what about that? Do you imagine them as archaic objects, or do you think they are, you find them in flea markets? So are they sort of modern objects in a way? How do you see them? How do you place them?
We could say they are modern objects in the sense that I choose them so that they look familiar to us, since they belong to, let's say, the European Occidental culture. But also they are all objects that finally were mass-produced, so they are not handcrafted objects. They are really copies of things that were produced in the 17th or 18th century, but then that have been produced in a massive way, and that are finally quite standard, although they look like antiques.
Now that's really interesting, because in a sense when people talk about modern commodities or the kind of commodity fetish or kind of modern objects, you think perhaps about different sorts of things, but maybe these are kind of commodity fetishes par excellence, because these are mass-produced objects. They, in a way, question certain ideas about authenticity at the same time as they have maybe a reference to a classical lexicon, a kind of an iconography. But what about the feeling of, there's certainly a very powerful feeling of stillness, but there's also something quite funerary, you know, about these black and the brass together. I mean, can you speak a little bit about, do you want that kind of feeling of deathliness and the funerary monument, or what are you thinking about in
the use of the black in this installation? It's the first time that I use color and black in this kind of installations. Is both the black is meant to make the objects that are inside the installation more iconic, let's say, and so the black is used as a ground color, but also as a figure in itself, and of course it's quite symbolic because it's linked to funerary feeling. And I think that this funerary aspect is interesting to me in the way that I am very interested. I always work with the same object, and that we see in this installation, and I am interested in this object in the sense that they may have something sentimental or familiar or carry memories to us, and so we have a tendency, I think, to, let's say, animate them or to anthropomorphize them. And what is interesting to me is this relation we have to object as animated subject, we have to non-animated object, and it's basically this passage from a subjectivity trying to understand an objectivity and something non-animated.
So do you think in a way the direction of the work is more in the direction of this sort of freezing or stilling of the object, or more in the direction of animating the experience, or a mixture? I wonder.
I have the feeling that there is a stillness in the work, both in this kind of the installation that we see here, or in the plaster cast or the rubber cast. But for this kind of installation, for example, the fact that after seeing the frontal image, we can walk through and deconstruct the object, I think there is let's say that the position of the viewer is supposed to be quite active in opposition to maybe the stillness of the work, and by walking through the work also there is this deconstructive movement that to me is quite close to something cinematographic or cinematic, and it's like seeing something from front and then from side and then from top. So it's also a question of getting different point of views. So although the object has a strong stillness, as I think, maybe the position, I hope, of the viewer is quite active, let's say.
So in one sense, the Témoins oculaires, this is a position in a way that is mobile and is not necessarily your own eyes or your own viewing position, but is a viewing position that is mobile and cinematic.
Yeah.
So in that way, I mean, when you were speaking about that, it helps me to see a really intimate kind of relationship between the work downstairs and the films upstairs. And can you say a little bit more, I suppose, about that idea of the cinematic, even though, you know, I suppose that the work downstairs generally will get called installation, whatever that kind of means, but in some ways you're gluing them together, bringing them together through the idea of a cinematic.
Yeah. In the films that are presented upstairs, it's again the same kind of objects that are presented, and it's really small displays that I film, so contrary to this large installation. But it's true that at the same time the objects in the films are displayed a bit in the same way, so as kind of landscapes. And it is the camera that has the place of the viewer, in the sense that it's a very early film grammar with wide shots, still images, wide shots, close shots, and different point of view on the same objects. And so somehow there is an editing in this movie, in the way the film is constructed, that may recall the experience of the viewer in this large installation.
There you have a lot of bits and pieces, the kind of flea market aesthetic, I guess. And there are bits of jewellery, and I guess there are bits and pieces that might conventionally attach to some notion of a kind of feminine, a kind of feminine identity, the kind of props or accoutrements of femininity, which you've explored a lot in your work. But then there are also kind of next to lipsticks, they're bullets, and so in some ways I wondered about that question of sexual identity and you know, a sphere of femininity that you may be exploring, or how important that is to you, or not.
When I started this series of installation, I was very interested in the notion of commodity fetishism and by extension fetishism, and so our relation to this kind of object. And indeed, there is in the choice of this object strong polarity with elements that are at the beginning were mostly linked to notions of value, exchange, money, and finally it came to pageantry representation, social representation, but also finally a representation of a sexual identity somehow. So there are a lot of ornaments, jewelry, or little lipstick, and so on, that are both linked to the idea of exchange, representing the self or a social group, and also sexuality.
It's interesting that in shot you have that mixture of jewelry or things that are almost kind of prosthetic extensions of the body. But you also have money, you have coins, and there are different sort of systems of exchange, I guess, bodily, intimate, and economic.
Yes, in a lot of works like the one presented here, or the films, or the cast, I usually work in terms, let's say, of categories. And as you said, I would think in terms of bodily or money or value, exchanges of value, or mimesis to nature, or to or other kind of representation. So the objects are indeed chosen according to certain categories.
But when you're using film, I think you use, you know, is it analog film that you're using? I mean, it's now on a digitized loop, but it's got an archaic feel to it. Can you describe how you make those films, or how you made them?
The films are little setups of objects, and they are shot in 16 millimeters. And it's true that the use of the film, it's both to have the grain and the space of the 16 millimeter, but it's also a way of having a performative and even childish aspect to the realization of the film, because it has to go really quickly. I put the object together and then I film them. And to me, what is interesting in this analog process is the fact that the objects are like, what is filmed is printed. It's about really imprint. They are printed on the film. So it's not at all the same. It's really like a cast, but in movement and flat. So it's very different than a digital way of recording things.
Well, I think in a way we haven't talked about, and it's really crucial to your work, and certainly to on this loop of images, there have been a lot of your casts, like this one, called the Homonym series. And the whole idea of the homonym, the whole idea of the cast, you've talked about the cast, you've mentioned, I think, the imprint, and although there are none of the homonyms in the exhibition here, or I think in Bristol, it seems a really fundamental idea. And they're also obviously kind of still life, which have that sense of vanitas and mortality, all of those ideas. So seems in a way at the core of the work. And I wondered if you could explain, some of us have seen them. There was one in the show at the ICA, the painting show at the ICA recently, so people might have seen a plaster version, but whether you can talk a little bit about them, because I think
so again, it's what is for me important in the cast, whether they are plaster cast or rubber cast. It's first I will describe the process. I do composition with objects that I stock, and then it's casted with silicone. And so once you get the mold, you pour into the mold liquid material that is either plaster or rubber or whatever you want. But what is for me important is the fact that it's the cast is a solidification of a liquid shapeless material that by with the solidification takes a shape. So there is a passage from something shapeless, the material, to something that has a shape and that we call a form or possibly an art object. And so this passage for me between something shapeless to something that has finally a shape is very much related to this funerary question we were raising, which is this morbid relation we can you described to the object or the stillness of the installation and cast. And the installation are more related to landscape composition, but it's true that the cast are more related to still life paintings.
I mean, in some ways that relationship to a death mask, I suppose, that sense of some primal scene of which is counterintuitive, obviously, but that's the beginning of it. That's, in a way, it seems the beginning of representation in the work. But also, there's something, as we were saying earlier, much more mobile. There is that kind of freezing and stillness, but there's also metamorphosis, and the poussin example is the way in which the painting system works and the way in which you seem to, in your work, dramatize something about the way materials, transmorph or transmute into one another. So you have this, is it onyx that?
Yes, it's onyx.
That ornament,
Cup.
that thing. And so how does that relate to the poussin painting, which I think is the poussin painting you were thinking of in relation to this work is Hercules and Calcus, I think it's.
Yeah, Hercules and
so
Calcus.
there was a watery feel, I think, you were wanting to counter with the monumental aspects of the.
Yeah, the painting I was inspired by for this installation is called Hercule and Cacus, and it's a landscape with a giant at the top of a mountain, and at the foreground you can see a river. So there is in this painting there is the river is very important, and also the reflections of the river are very important. And so it was translated in the installation by the use of material like brass or onyx in the cups that contains water and so on. But this system of translation from or metamorphosis from painting to installation maybe applied in other kind of works. And for example, I could, from a film where I do little painting, translate on then these paintings into large spray wall paintings, as there were several shown in Spike Island at the moment. So the system of metamorphose in between different kind of medium and shapes is very important, and I think that in this system of translation, I hope there is a meaning that may be a commentary on the notion of medium and what each medium brings as meaning.
These are the.
Yes.
I think it's interesting to relate this because I think in some ways, you know, this is very far from a notion of medium as medium specific. Or painting should be self-referential to painting. And so this is one of the monochrome spray wall paintings that are shown at Spike Island. But I'm not sure which one is called, there's one called Reproduction 1.
Yes.
So can you explain that? Because that seemed really interesting, that not only do you have this kind of morphing of one haptic, fetishy material into another, but also that kind of highly mediatized set, you know, there's something multiple about the kind of mediatized process. So even in the process of making these things, you have this kind of morphing of one thing into another. So they'll come on the screen, but you started out, I think, by making a film. So the first step is to make a spray.
The spray was filmed, yeah.
So you're making a wall painting that's being sprayed, which begins like one of these spray paintings but we'll fill it to become a complete monochrome.
Perhaps, I don't know if we could show the
Have
film.
we got one of those? Yes, that would be
flou
great.
et coloré. It's flou et coloré. So it's a 3-minute long 16mm film. No, I think it's good.
Yes, no, that's great. It's it's hard to explain. It's so lucid and pure when you see it. It's just kind of like you immediately sort of.
So I will talk on it.
Yes, good idea.
Because it's silent, so it will not disturb anyone. So basically this is part of the little setup I do in my studio, and here what you see is me behind, you don't see me, but I am behind the camera doing very quick spray paintings, and there are 10 of them, and they are very small, they are 20 by 40 centimeters, the original ones, and I divided this, there are different, let's say, categories. There are monochromes, soft abstractions, you see stripes, diagonals, verticals and horizontals, and 4 of the films are kind of landscape compositions that I very quickly copy from Monet paintings. The first series of the Meule de Foin. I don't know if someone can help me with that. No, Alice.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so the idea is to paint really quickly with the less subjectivity possible, and I realize, so let's say 10 little tableaux. And it's a very simple editing. I just I just took the ones that were finished in time and so on. But basically, it's more or less the resulting film is more or less what was filmed. there is not much editing. And after this piece that I did in 2010, I was interested in somehow doing a new series of works that are copies of the films, of the paintings that you see in the film. And so the paintings that you would see previously and the ones that are at Spike Island, that are wall spray paintings in 4 by 5 meters large, so really large formats, are called reproductions, and they look like color fields or large monochromes, or they seem to belong, let's say, to a tradition of modern art and painting, but they are actually reproduction of stills of the films, of these films. And so in this way there is a system of copy, of translation, because the idea is to enlarge both the images and the texture of the spray can grain. And for me, what was interesting is to produce paintings that look like paintings but are not really pure paintings. It's about this notion of copy and of the fact that what you see is not exactly what you think you see according to art's historical categories.
So in a way, every time you make that work, it is another reproduction. Yes. So thus the title. So in a way, inverting our normal kind of presuppositions or assumptions about originals and copies. But I wondered whether, one of the things that seems to me very distinctive about your work is you can see that in a lot of your work, that questioning of the unique, singular artwork, or you're thinking about reproducibility and replication. You're thinking about what copies or mass-produced copies of, antique-looking objects alike, under conditions of modernization. But you, in a way, look back to this moment in the early 1600s as your kind of primal scene, of your particular form of commodity fetishism. So it's not like looking back to Baudelaire as, normal narratives would have it, or even the late 18th century. It's this, what people now in art history anyway always talk about as the early modern. And I wonder why, what interested you about that pull back to, a much earlier time in a way than, because, Poussin is not figuring in your work as this kind of idealist classicist. He's figuring here as this, the first modernist in a way, which really interests, I think, me, certainly, I'm sure all of us, and what it is about that moment.
In the 16th century, there is this very interesting moment where, with the apparition of the mechanical reproduction, and somehow a paradigmatic shift in the representation of nature, since at the classical time, let's say, with Leonardo da Vinci, the idea of virtuosity was the highest level of copy of nature, and with the apparition of the mechanical reproduction, which is the imprint, basically, this paradigm shift, because there was no more full virtuosity, since it was possible to copy perfectly something in a mechanical and thus non-subjective way. So I was very intrigued and interested in this non-subjective way of reproducing an object, natural or constructed. And I looked a lot, especially at these manierist grottos of the Italian 16th century, in which you can see in the grottos animals or plants that are sculpted and that seem to get out or emerge from a sort of groundy, earthy background that is actually sculpted, everything, but is finally sculpted. But there is this idea that that at the same time that there is this apparition of the mechanical reproduction, and so you can copy nature in the best way you want. At the same time appear these grottos in which you see shape sculpted inside shapeless background. So there is a very interesting relation to the representation of nature and then of the world. It was.
I mean, I guess the last thing I'd like to ask you before we open it up is in a way about, and I suppose it has to do with that, looking back and thinking about almost a classical tradition, but you know, the way you do that is to kind of contaminate it with Duchamp, with that kind of base materialism that you've just mentioned. But you also have mentioned frequently, I think, the fact that you want it's important to you to get or to maintain a kind of detachment, or, you know, in some ways the idea of detachment or of some kind of objectification, some sort of abstraction, which, you know, in a way those black planes are abstracting, and they're distancing effects in some ways, and you're mixing that up with these objects that are mass-produced, but they also seem to have a sense of affect, or, you know, pathos or sentimental attachment. And so I think it's very interesting, the mixed message that one gets, you know, that in a way those things are confusing for us as we're in the work between attachment and detachment, and whether you can say something about that, but also what you want to kind of retrieve. You know, sometimes detachment or that kind of objectification is seen in terms of some kind of idealist position that we want to, you know, we're well beyond, and we, you know, is impossible. We can't maintain that kind of position of being able to abstract from the world. And I just wonder what it is that you feel is important to maintain in that.
For me, what I try to maintain in this mix of constructive or minimalist or schematic grids with figures that are objects that are very narrative or that have a strong emotional charge is basically I try to avoid this idealistic point of view, and to both get something that is both loaded with pathos and at the same time that can be understood in a distanced way. So it's really what you said.
But you don't want it to be identified with yourself?
No.
So in some ways, do you think that's a danger, of that there's a danger to that kind of subjectivism that's identified with the artist as herself? Or
what I try to avoid is a whole system of naturalization. So it's to essentialize or to naturalize things and shapes and forms. That's why spray wall painting would look like let's say modern painting, but actually it's a copy of something else, and large installation is the translation of ancient archetypical landscape, but it's both minimalistic and loaded with figures. So it's this play with forms and metamorphose. It's about avoiding any kind of naturalization.
No, that's really an interesting point. Well, I mean, perhaps we should open up to questions. I'm sure people have very themselves interesting points or questions.
Are there any questions? If not, maybe then I start with a question, because I feel like what I constantly keep thinking about is photography, and I feel like you've been speaking about it all the time, but at the same time not framed it as such. And if I look at your installations, I can't help but thinking about advertisement photography, like Paul Alterbridge, their backdrops, so like an early ethnographical photography, and then you do photos as well. So maybe you can speak briefly about photography.
I didn't do photos, but I did scans of objects. So I did few works that we can see that are object displayed and scanned on a large table. And I use this medium, let's say, just like a way of casting. So the plaster or the rubber cast are imprints of objects in volumes, and the scans, or let's say the photography, are imprints of the things in plan and with color also, because plaster and the rubber cast are often colored, but they are monochrome. It's not naturalistic colors. So it's true that in this photography may be important in this idea of stillness, mechanical reproduction, and let's say imprint. But I don't do so much photo in itself.
Do you think you could say that in a way, the way that, you know, analog photography obviously dramatized things about indexicality that digital photographs don't, and that this is the way to, in a way, you know, it's not through making photographs anymore, but actually to make sculptures or installation that becomes possible?
I think it is.
Well, in some ways, I think, Anna, you know, that's a very powerful idea, isn't it? That photography, par excellence, was the medium that would be
media.
the indexical medium. You know, analog photography, the imprint on light-sensitive paper. You know, Roland Barthes, and this was something deathly. Everything, a lot of the things we've been talking about, this kind of the stillness, the lost object, everything is there. But obviously with the demise of analog photography, that process in a way is lost. I mean, you could make analog photographs, you could. But in some ways, perhaps that set of ideas has migrated in your work to something much more palpable and three-dimensional and experiential. That's what I was thinking.
I think it's indeed more experiential, and for me it's at least more deconstructive. There is again a sort of indeed dramatization or even naturalization in photography for me. That is, it's a medium I have problems to deal with, although I know the whole work may talk a bit about that. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks very much. I thought what you said about liquidity and being in that space was really brilliant, because our experience of it was, when we went in, was very much that sense of things merging in together. So that was very nice. But I wanted to ask a question about the film upstairs and that moment when the collection of these sort of abject fragments and objects, and it seemed to me quite funny, but I'm not sure if it's meant to be funny, but the moment where, as if these objects were like in a seance or something, they all start to wobble about like that. And also then, I think it's at the same time that there's a kind of light, purple, kitschy light that shines on it. And I just wondered if what that was to you, and if you could talk about that.
The shaky moment was indeed supposed to be funny, so I'm happy to it. And no, it's as I say, it's quite childish and naive. So very childishly, let's say, the shaky moment was to recall that we are in a medium in movement. So I have the image moving instead of the camera doing the movement, and the use of colored light. It came a bit. It came with this film, and it was meant to create a sort of new point of view on the object, because before the question of point of view was mainly treated through perspective and geometrical, so-called geometrical composition. And after with this film, I thought that I may use color as a sort of new point of view. And also it's flickering, and the flicker was important in this idea of the deconstruction of the image. In this inform idea of Rosalind Krauss and Yves Limbois, that the syncope, there is the syncopic, syncopic movement deconstruct an image that is constructed.
Thank you.
I think the syncope is the gap, isn't it? This, you know, like an interval, or a hiatus. Thank you.
Hi. Your use of over here. Your use of objects and composition remind me a lot of traditions in still life painting, and I was wondering if you were interested in still life painting and maybe the connotations involved in that.
Yeah. Yes, I am. I was very. I looked a lot at still life painting. I especially like a French painter that is Chardin. I don't remember his first name. And but what I was interested in the still life paintings are really the way of composition and how everything is somehow crushed on one ground. And there is also this symbolic aspect, of course, and metaphysical aspect with the deadly thing Briony was talking about, and the fact it's all about vanitas. And what is interesting also to me with the still life is the fact that they are enclosing a time, not a time capsule, but they are a representation of time. So it's a pictorial, it's of course a pictorial object, but that are representative of, that try to represent time. So that was very interesting to me.
Thank you. Actually, first I wanted to ask about just a photograph that was right before this one, which was a green work, which just has a lot of kind of works crushed onto it. Or, and if you just want to talk a little bit about that. And then my question really was about the installation in the main gallery. And I think you haven't spoken at all about the golden panels. And I was just wondering also about the fact that the use of gold and dark colors and the really beautiful decorative objects that you use, there's a certain elegance and a certain opulence, but at the same time the materials, I mean the black and that golden, they're almost quite cheap, or quite kind of cheap imitations of a type of kind of red velvet, or, and I wonder if you wanted to maybe talk about that tension.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's no, the use of brass. It's brass actually. It's not pure gold, but it's not cheap brass neither. It's quite expensive actually. But anyway, now the use of brass. In regards to the painting I worked with, let's say, in a very loose way, was meant to, the idea was to work on a notion of opacity and reflection, and there is, in this sense, also a notion on fetishism, and what you say about seduction and elegance, it's meant to relate to this this commodity fetishism or fetishism, this fetishization thing, which is also a sort of haptic movement. So the idea is to talk about the will of possessing and looking at things, and when looking at them, possessing them, and which is maybe also both which leads us to sort of an economical aspect. This is why there are coins, bills, jewelry, and so on, and also to a sexual aspect, which is also the representation of the self, or more direct sexual representations. So this is also what you were mentioning earlier, I think. I don't know if I answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think also.
No, no, but it's important that the objects are not, as we were saying, not may look a bit cheap. Some of them, because they indeed were chosen because they were submitted to this system of devaluation, and so they are meant to be seen as mass-produced also. Yeah.
No, exactly. I think maybe cheap was not necessarily the right word, but modern in a sense that it's very.
It's okay.
You instantly recognize the mass production technology. And in terms of the previous question, the first question was about the photograph.
Yes.
The green, dark green. Yeah. The work was just if you want to just talk a little bit about that type of work process.
I don't know which one.
Oh, I see. Okay. Let's wait a bit. It's
yes. The photographs, les images. Okay. These are scans of objects, and so they are kind of non-composed accumulation of objects that are scanned, and so that I get a file that is an image in which then I reframe and I cut compositions. I don't know if it's very clear, but what I want to say is that for this series of work that is called Moulage sur le vif, the idea is the composition is not of the object or of the image, is not when I put the object and I scan them, but it's in a post-production way when I frame. So composition comes with framing and not with installing. I don't know if it's clear. No, it's not clear.
I just wonder if it's the work that I was asking about. Yes.
This one?
No. Yeah. Which actually seemed this one.
This one. No.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's not my fault. Now these are the rubber cast I was talking about, and these are a cast of composition of objects I glue and then cast with a silicone mold. And when I was talking about solidification and liquidification, Briony was talking about I was thinking of this kind of work. So basically, they are rubber cast. It's in one block. So it's all stuck together. It's one piece of rubber, and it's always this little jewelry, pageantry, coins, objects that are organized in a symmetrical way. So for me, it was related to a category of representation that is, let's say, a sort of formal correspondences. So how you build an image only with formal concerns. I'm sorry.
And are those on the edges? Are they typewriter reels?
Yes.
Ribbons. Yeah. Thanks. It's really
Actually, no. I'm sorry. It's it's real for 16 millimeters.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Also, it's much bigger than. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Gosh, lots to think about. Thank you. I suppose I was interested in understanding what your views towards reproduction of your own work were, because it seems that a lot of the devices that you're using are different modes of reproducing, and you're sort of using that mode of reproducing to question our assumption around particular themes of arts, particular art historical ideas. So reproducing your spray paintings on a scale that on first glance would appear as a modernist painting, but underneath it's reproduction, and perhaps similar to the way Poussin reproduced classical tropes but use them as a vehicle to think in other ways. And I just wondered what your attitude was to how people reproduce and record your work, especially the sculptural works where the viewer's interaction is more important? Sorry, lots of questions. So I suppose reproduction you use a lot in your work. So you use reproduction in terms of casting, scanning, making films of events and objects, and making reproductions in the paintings. How do you feel about the way your work is recorded for the future?
You mean the documentation?
Yes, how it's documented. Yes. And also, is reproduction sort of core to everything you do? Because it seems that everything you do is sort of a reproduction of something.
No, it's not. It's about question of subjectivity and objectivity. So it implies the notion of reproduction, but also of translation and interpretation. So it's more about mimesis and ekphrasis. And I think that I would rather talk of this modernist moment of. I would go again to Duchamp, let's say, on the question of subjectivity, rather than talking only about reproduction. And actually,
I think I used the wrong word. I think that retranslation is probably the better word, because that. Sorry.
No.
So I suppose my final question then is, how do you view reproductions of your work? So rather than the retranslation that you're doing with a particular agenda, how do you view the way your work is documented in books, in so on?
I think the question is to find, of course, what is the more representative and that may embody the meaning of the work. So, for example, for the large installation, I mainly try to have documentation that are frontal, because it reproduces the experience of the work that you have when you go into the room, and I think that the experience of deconstruction of the work when you walk through should be left to the viewer who went to the exhibition.
I'm just wondering what your studio practice is like, or if you have a studio, and what it kind of looks like in there, because as you're like discussing the work, everything feels so rational and linear and researched and theoretical, and I'm wondering if there is any error or chance, or how you get to these results. Sorry.
Alice and Juliette, who work at Spikeland, are laughing because we set up the show together at Spikeland, and there is a lot of chance and randomness, and the meaning is being created at the moment when you do the work. And of course, after retrospectively, it looks, what you do retrospectively, not when you do it. The analysis of the work and its theoretical construction, let's say, is retrospective. You may have intuitions and go in certain directions and have intuitions strong enough so that you finally go a bit always in the same direction, but it's very, there is something childish and playful and completely naive, and really a lot about chance, and it's the construction of the analytic construction, commentary on the work is retrospective. I don't know if it's a good thing.
You know where to give room for experiments, and
yes.
You know where to have like a total control of things, and your work is all about this kind of balancing
yes.
too.
Yeah.
That's why it's fascinating to see work, because you know exactly where you're going. But if you leave like things under someone else's control, it's also a decision of yours.
Yes. No, it happens. It's true that it happens several. I may ask to, for example, some of the compositions of objects that are casted. It's not. I didn't do them because I don't mind. The question is not how it is composed. The question is that it's in one piece of a solidified liquid, and it's this object, and it's accumulated and not organized, but after that it can be something or something else. And what is very interesting to me is, and I guess for every artist, is in what way the how do you say, comment on dit le contenant change le contenu. The shape of the content change the meaning, and sometimes the change of the content doesn't change the meaning, and sometimes it does.
So who arranges the composition then? The person that's casting it?
It's my assistant.
Your assistant, okay.
Yes. No, but not always. Sometimes I do it myself, but it's not. For some pieces, it's a necessity. For example, the work that is in the main room, it's very, very arranged, and we displace it. It's 1 centimeter and not 2 centimeters, and so on. But for some other things, the absence of subjectivity in the process of working is important. And it's this question about meaning and how the meaning is visible in the form. And sometimes the meaning is more visible in a random and not decided form.
That comes over also, don't you think?
This is because of Duchamp.
But also as much as the process, but also in the process of experiencing the work, because in some ways it seems like a kind of a deconstruction of the classical model and of order, because the whole fetishistic, that compulsive, that seduction by a material or the kitsch, the appeal, the attraction cuts against that kind of rational ordering of things, and it's kind of interesting. I think Bataille had that wonderful phrase, if only the art collector could love his art like the fetishist loves his shoe. I mean, the whole idea of a fetishist is that it is not obedient, polite collecting of things. It's sexual, libidinal. It's, and that seems important to kind of completely create chaos with that sense of order that on the surface the appeal is there, but the real appeal kind of cuts against that. There was one other question, I think, over there, and then maybe we should...
I think that will be the last one.
But me, I wanted to ask you a question too.
Hi. I was just hoping for you to expand a bit upon your use of maybe exotic sort of objects, or the sense of maybe the other with sort of fans or porcelain sort of vases.
Yeah, in the first series, Paysage avec poussin, they were more, and in the films that are here also, they are present, but in the first installation, they were more of exotic objects. And they were linked to like Persian carpets or fake Chinese vases. And because I was very interested in the notion of colonialism and expansion of the space, and I was more precisely thinking also of Marcel Brotars, who made this little atlas to the use of artists and militaries. And you have the thing that artists colonize is very bad, but mental space, and militaries, mental territories. The relation he made in between military and artists was quite interesting and funny to me. But to be more precise, in this first installation, I was interested in the way that the fact by using patterns that Europeans found, let's say, abroad after big discoveries, by re-employing them, reproducing them, it's basically how you take over the world by representing it. And it's on system of representation as also systems of domination somehow. And I don't know if...
I think this might be a good moment to take the conversation to a more informal area, to the bar. And just quickly, before I ask you to join me in thanking Briony and Isabelle, I want to make a couple of announcements. I just wanted to say that Isabelle shows a film to be shown alongside her exhibition that we're playing on March 25th. And it's Frederick Wiseman's store, and we're going to show the 60mm version, so I hope you can join us for that. Right. And yeah, other than that, I just want to thank both of you for this fantastic conversation.
I would like to thank Briony because
and of course, Briony.
Nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.